And so session 2 today, we're shifting focus somewhat. So the title, as you can see up here, Climate Hope Taking Action. And I think Emma alluded to this topic quite nicely in her introductory remarks. That she outlined quite clearly how deteriorating mental health, climate change, it can become this vicious cycle. And Nicole brought up in her presentation as well these new terms like ecological grief, eco-anxiety, but then also this overwhelming sense of hopelessness or paralysis and even fatalism. And so today I'm joined by a really exciting group of panelists who I'll introduce in a minute. But we want to talk a little bit about how to leverage some of what Emma called those, I think, uncomfortable emotions like anger, and also overcome these feelings of hopelessness into really promoting climate action, which of course not only helps alleviate some of the negative effects of climate change, but also can improve mental health. So as I said, I'm joined by quite an exciting panel of people. I'm going to take a seat now. My awkward two-seated transition. But they're all deeply engaged in this work, but coming at it from a lot of very different perspectives, which I think will be really great for the discussion. So here to my left, we have Alana Quintasket. Pronounced her name correctly, excellent. She's the vice chair of the Swinomish Indian tribal community, is an interim senator for the Swinomish governing body, and I believe you're the youngest member of the Senate as well. Next to her, we have Terrell Engmann, who's a fourth-year PhD candidate at Boise State studying metastatic breast cancer. But on the side, in his spare time, he's also the co-founder of Basilica Bio, which does community work on environmental justice and chronic disease. Next, we have Howie Frumkin, who is the senior vice president of the Trust for Public Land, where he's also the director of the Land and People Lab. Of course, former dean of the UW School of Public Health, with a background as a physician and epidemiologist. And then there on the end, we have Aurora Martin, co-executive director of Friends Centered, which is a coalition of community groups that work at the intersection of equity, environmental and climate justice. So I went through that quite quickly, but don't worry, because throughout the conversation, they'll draw on their work a bit. So I think what would be useful as a start, Howie, for you, what we're going to talk about in this session a lot is the sense of hope and hopelessness, etc. So maybe start with definitions. How would you define those for us, and how do you see those emotions manifesting in the context of climate change?
Testing 1, 2. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's been an honor to be here with these panelists. What a great meeting this has been so far. So hope, well, there's a whole bookshelf full of books about hope. It's a deep literature, and for me, the definition that's most useful is sort of a standard definition from the psychology field. Hope has 3 components. We've heard about them all today, but I'm going to put them together. The first component is a destination, a vision, a thing that you hope for. Second component is a path to get there. So you have to have a sense that you can get from here to there. You can get to hope. And the third is agency. You have to have a way to activate that pathway so that you can actually take steps toward achieving. So it's destination, pathway, agency. Each of those has thinking, cognitive structures, and emotions attached to it. Just a couple of little elaboration details. Is there such a thing as excessive hope? Can you hope too much? Well, that's debatable. Turns out that all hope includes an element of uncertainty. It doesn't make any sense for me to say, I hope the sun rises tomorrow, because I know it's going to, there's no uncertainty there. It also doesn't make any sense for me to say, I hope to live to be 1,000 years old. That won't happen at all. But somewhere in between 100% certainty and 0% certainty is the thing that I hope for. So hope lives in the place of uncertainty. It's beautifully written about by Rebecca Solomon, who's one of our finest thinkers and writers in that book. Since you have to live in that place of uncertainty, then you want to have pathways to get to where you want to be. You want to have the agency development there. I'm going to stop with that. That's the definition of hope.
Am I on? Yes. No, I think that's a great kind of framing to start. And So now kind of thinking about that application, Helena, I want to turn to you. So, you know, in your role with Swedish Tribe, I know your portfolio spans a huge number of different types of issues. But of course, climate change is sort of overarching and interacts with a lot of the different things you're doing. So how are you seeing members of your own community reacting to some of the threats brought about by climate change in terms of, you know, emotional responses? And do you see in any way that these responses vary across generations, perhaps?
Yeah, definitely. So in our community, obviously, we have young people from babies all the way through the old people, the elders. And you can see in the younger people, there is a lot of hopelessness when it comes to the climate change. And how they respond to it is they just don't have a lot of care for things anymore. You know, they don't have a lot of care to learn about anything, be connected to the land, the environment. And I think the biggest obstacle for me in carrying on our way of life, our way of being, our way of existing that's been here since time immemorial, is they're not interested in having children. And that is a vital part of carrying on our culture, carrying on our way of life, the next generation. It's something that our people have looked forward to since the beginning of time, is growing and expanding and having those relationships. You know, that's a part of what marriage and having children is expanding our territory, expanding our relationship across this place, and passing on that knowledge, the intergenerational knowledge that has been passed down through generations and generations. And so I think with the young people, that's the hardest thing that I see is so many of them not wanting to have that next generation. And it's something that I think about often too, you know. I have so much hope with the Plant Garden project that Jamie brought up. Like I'm so excited that my children, my future children, will never know a day without the Plant Garden project. But then it's also like, do I really want another generation to fight? You know, to have that same fight that I have today, that my grandma had, my grandparents had, all the way back to the treaty signatories that I descend from, the fight that we've been living since the 1850s, right? But then I also see the older people, you know, like my late papa, we talked about this often as he passed away from cancer earlier this year. We had so many conversations about this because he's a lifelong fisherman, you know, and so he saw the change in his lifetime from the climate impacts that he had from the river to the Salish, the Skagit River to the Salish Sea. And he would tell me often, you know, I'm really afraid for your future, Alana, and I know you're a good fighter. I know you've got that fight and you don't ever stop fighting. Don't ever stop fighting for our people, for our treaty rights, for our way of life. And so he knew going out of this world that we exist in today that this is a long-term battle, and he didn't ever think that he would see the day that we would be experiencing the issues that we have now. You know, and I hear that often from the old people. It's like, I thought I'd be long gone by the time we did this, but here I am still here dealing with the wildfire smoke, you know, dealing with no fishery openings in different ways that it impacts our way of life.
Well, thanks for that response, and there's a lot there, and I will come back to later because I do want to explore more the climate project that I know Jamie brought up with the earlier session. But I mean, I think it's a good segue in a sense of, you know, we see this sense of hopelessness, we see this paralysis. What do we do about it? You know, and how can we try and move beyond that and get people to be engaged? And so, Aurora, the next question I want to ask for you, I mean, because obviously front and center of your organization, you work. You're very much integrated with communities and you work with them. So what are some of the ways that your organization tries to work with communities to encourage climate action? And what are some of the most effective ways that you found to engage communities on the topic?
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for this invitation, as well as so honored to be on this panel with all of you. On behalf of the Front and Center, a growing coalition of over 70 community-based organizations, grassroots to medium size to large size with very diverse coalition of community groups with a diverse set of missions as well, coming together around the challenge of climate justice and how we activate hope, I think. And I was thinking about hope and mental health and how it is that we're kind of coming together, preparing for our annual membership summit in the next couple of months. How we activate hope at Front Centered is about people, practice, and policy. I know the next session, we're going to have a panel discussion. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be here, but I know my friend Elise and others are going to carry the water and talk about concrete steps. But people, practice, and policy is how Front Centered as a small backup center for this growing coalition activates hope. First, we convene the people. And we do so by actually this thing called community building. So as the co-executive director of capacity building, what is capacity building? What does community building mean? It means relationships. It means spending time together. It means co-creating, co-learning, and just being there for each other, listening. Practice. What do we mean by practice? It also means taking that vision that Howie had actually talked about in terms of that element of hope, and the vision that we have is for a just transition whereby it is equitable and sustainable, that the future fundamentally is shifted by a different set of values that underpin the sort of shift in the mental models and the way in which we govern, the way in which we relate, the way in which we imagine democracy. Policy is where we actually act. And I know that I'm assuming that Elise will probably talk a bit about one of the biggest policy wins that the coalition, along with many other partners throughout the state, have been able to achieve, and that is the Healthy Environment for All Act. And I think the HEAL Act. In 2021, it was a big win, and the promise of HEAL is such that I think it embodies the activation of hope. It embodies this sort of bold vision for what we imagine as a coalition of community groups, as a coalition of those who are at the front lines, as a coalition of people who are the first and worst hit, those who are at the fence lines of pollution, of industry, and the impacts of environmental hazards. And so the HEAL Act is very ambitious, one of the most ambitious actually in the country, and we had an opportunity to actually consult with the White House about how we did it. And that is imagine very boldly the notion of government differently, the notion that in this time where climate change is the biggest sort of existential threat to people and planet, that we imagine that governance must be different, that communities who are the first and worst affected must be centered. And that is why you'll hear about the HEAL Act actually centering environmental justice. And what does that mean? That means that 7 state agencies, at least 7 state agencies representing millions and billions of dollars and many, many regulations affecting industry, affecting people, affecting communities, affecting 39 counties and many, many cities, have to actually be in compliance with changing regulations that will eventually, we're not there yet, center environmental justice. And that also means a new trajectory of resources as well from the state level. So that's how we activate hope.
I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about some of the things that you've raised. Thinking still about kind of ways in which community organizations can be involved. Terrell, you also work for an organization on similar topics, but a different approach. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about your own experiences, sort of the same type of question and reflections. And then also maybe what are some, concrete examples of the types of things that you've implemented in communities and how those have been effective?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. An amazing invitation, and I feel very privileged to be up here with these folks. So yes, like you mentioned, I co-founded an environmental justice community-based organization called Basilica Bio, and our programs, essentially the reason why we formed it in the first place is because we saw a need for action in the environmental justice space and supporting, especially educators, to go beyond learning into action. And there's such an opportunity in our youth to be able to, harness that energy and the real concern and passion that you would have for our climate and our world, and connecting them to the existing efforts that are there. So we created an environmental justice curriculum for teachers to be able to use, high school teachers and middle school teachers, and also professional development resources for those teachers to be able to implement some of these curricula and to tackle some of these really difficult sometimes to talk about topics. And in addition to that, we also hold community events in partnership with a lot of great folks, a lot of Black farming groups in particular, in order to get students connected to those efforts and to get hands-on in the soil, and also have a context for why that's important. So literally physically changing our environmental resources, the assets that we have as a community, building our hyper-local food systems, those are incredibly important to us, and I think it starts with the education, and so we're trying to make those resources more available, more accessible, exciting for teachers to be able to adopt and easy to implement as well. Yeah.
No, that's great. I mean, and I think just hearing from the two you just now observed, it's very clear, well, three of you really, it's very clear kind of what role community leaders, community organizers need to play in terms of climate action. And also, of course, there's a big component of policy as well, which I'll ask in a bit. But first, Howie, so you're a doctor. So what role do you think doctors have to play here? I mean, is this something that makes more sense to leave to, activists and to policy, or is there something that, clinicians be doing, or people who work in public health?
I think, thanks for the question. I think doctors and nurses and other health professionals do have a role, but it's a complementary role to all of the community-based roles we just heard about, and to policy change. There are lots of levers we need to pull. But in the context of hope, health professionals need to care about hope for a couple of reasons. One is that hope is good for you, and hopelessness is bad for you. There's a list as long as my arm of the disease risks that are higher in hopeless people than hopeful people. Second reason to care about it is that hopeful people get stuff done. And hopeless people, when you sink into despair, you don't get much done. It's a moment in history where we need to get a lot done. So we should be all about propelling hope for that reason. And there's one other reason that I think we ought to be all about propelling hope, and that is that it's true. That there are people out there, the doomers, who are saying, "Oh, it's all over. Just get ready to eat our food. That the world is going fantastic. Nothing we can do about it." But that's actually not true. The empirical evidence is that we have not lost this fight. We're in for some tough decades ahead, and our kids will be facing a different world than they want to be. There's no denying that. But we haven't lost. There's every reason to think that we can bend the curve and we can actually achieve better outcomes than we feared. And there's all kinds of evidence for that. The technology of batteries, the technology of transportation, the growth of activism. So from the social to the technological, there are good reasons to support it. It's good for you, feels better, it reduces your risks, it helps you be active instead of sinking into inactive despair, and there's good evidence to support it. So that's one of the reasons I think that everybody in this room, health professionals, wherever you are, should be a champion for hope. Talk about it, leave it into the value statement of your organization, call it out as an important foundational feeling and state of mind to help support all the other work that you need to do to tackle the climate crisis.
I mean, it's so clear the importance, not just from the sense of we have to tackle climate change, so people need to be motivated to do things, but just, for our own physical, mental, spiritual well-being, to conquer this issue of hope and hopelessness. And I think, we've seen, okay, what's the role for community leaders, what's the role for doctors? Of course, there's a really big role for government policy. We're going to talk about that explicitly in session 3. But obviously, each of you in your roles, you're very much kind of interacting with different levels of government. So I'm just sort of curious, kind of in your experiences, what have been some of the challenges? What are some things you wish they knew? Some of them are in the room, perhaps. But so maybe Terrell, for you first, in your work at Basilica, when you have conversations with people in communities, what is your sense about how they feel about climate change policy, government response lack thereof, and how is that feeding into feelings of hope, or maybe not? Maybe that's not the case.
Well, I think that's a really important question. I think in the community work that we do with all sorts of amazing organizations, with amazing teachers, with amazing students on the ground, there's a lot of hope because we are in the soil. We have conversations about the intersections of our health outcomes and our soils and our air and our water. And we see the need, and everyone is in agreement and willing to do the work. It becomes a little bit more, there's more resistance when other bodies are involved and things become a little bit more complex and complicated. And I really like what Howie said in the beginning of defining hope, that hope requires agency. So I think on the ground, when we have the ability to directly affect the environment around us, and we have support from different groups, we feel very hopeful. And in connecting this to policy, I think that there's a lot of hope in policy as well. We worked with the city of Seattle in terms of their food action plan very recently. We've been having a lot of discussions surrounding what education looks like in terms of food systems. Also what soil health considerations we can take in terms of imparting more food resources in places, and they've been very helpful and great collaborators in that conversation. I think sometimes, though, in some conversations in regard to different points when it comes to policy, it can be a little bit tough. So in terms of dealing with some of our polluting industries, for instance, there can be some barriers and things can get a little bit slower. And policy is sort of supposed to be the way in which we exercise our agency. And if we're told that you can work on this over here, but when we start to get to some of these topics, things get a little bit more difficult and we're not sure if we can do this. And, maybe next time, maybe go talk to this person. It's not surprising then that we can start to feel a little hopeless if our agency in the political process and policy can be kind of stripped away from us. So that's a really important consideration, I think, on the ground when it comes to hope is there's also a lot of distrust when it comes to policy, because as we're talking about some of the considerations of where we are today, I believe in the last session there was sort of a question of how to introduce trees into some gray areas and to make more green open spaces. And I think that as we are answering those questions, we have to also remember that those places aren't gray by accident, and they're a result of policy, like redlining policies of the past. And we've done this on purpose, and now we can purposefully undo things. And so it's important when we're discussing policy to have that in mind, that policy has been used in order to systematically harm people. And so we need to make sure that those people feel that they can participate in the process and that they have hope in the process. So yes, that's incredibly important.
Thanks so much. And Alana, I want to put that question to you too, because I think on this panel, you're in the unique role of you are setting policies for your community, and then at the same time, you're also interacting with government, trying to be the advocate for your community. So, I mean, to that end, how does this Wintermission community, tribal government, how do they interact with different levels of government in terms of climate policy in particular? And are there things you wish they knew, or do you feel support is lacking? And maybe where are some areas where things haven't working?
Yeah, there's a lot to that question. So I've been on the Senate since 2020, so I'm still a very new senator. And in my time on Senate, we have met with people from the city to the county to the state to the federal level, and we tell our story every single time. And it can get very frustrating for me because so often they come, they hear our story, and then there's no action. And so it is so frustrating for me because it's like, okay, so you're at the very top of this. Who do we need to talk to next? You know, so it can get so frustrating in that aspect. But we do work very hard at Swinomish to be sure that we're doing the best that we can to protect our environment, to protect our homelands, and to advocate for those that don't have a voice. You know, our relatives of the land, our relatives of the sea. And so that's what we're fighting for, you know, and it can feel so deflating, you know, like we go into these meetings and we have a lot of excitement, you know, this is an important person and we're excited to have them in our territory. Most of the time they're coming to visit us and they get to see our homelands and they're so gracious and so happy to be with us and they listen and they tell us they'll do something and then we never see them again or we never hear back from them. And so that's where I get very frustrated with the work that I do is who do we need to talk to make action, you know, to make these changes, to put things in place that protect across our entire territory, because we were segregated to the reservation that we live on today. I do not descend from the Swinomish people. I am a descendant of the Lower Skagit, the Kikialis, and the Samish, which is far beyond the reservation boundaries. And I feel so upset and so lost and just like, how do I protect my entire territory? That is my birthright. That is my responsibility to be a good relative, to look out for everything from the Salish Sea to the Skagit River to the Cascade Mountains. You know, so it spans across county boundaries, city boundaries, and so it's really challenging that there's so many levels and that it just sometimes feels like it's hard to take action that is meaningful and long-term. And so in my position now that I'm in today, that's where I see the most challenging things that come about. Yeah.
And it makes a huge amount of sense. And Aurora, I want to come to you because I feel like a lot of the work that you're doing is very much the sort of advocacy work kind of with the legislature to try and make these types of long-term changes. So I'm just curious kind of what you think the role of a community organization is in terms of that type of promotional activity, promoting climate action, but also like promoting these actual systemic changes maybe. And then also at the same time, it's hard to get this codified into law, but shifting the narrative around how we have to think about going about creating solutions.
Okay, first of all, I concur, Senator. It is frustrating and it is hard. And in fact, as a member of the Environmental Justice Council, which was newly created under the HEAL Act by statute to provide guidance to state agencies as they implement elements of the HEAL Act in their regulations. And shout out to my fellow EJC member, Maria Blancas. It's frustrating in terms of that reflection of here we have a bold vision, here we have this wonderful preamble, here we're saying the HEAL Act actually centers environmental justice, but the process is very bureaucratic. And so you have to go through a process. And when we talk about, as people of color, we're talking about code switching, we're talking about code switching to the nth degree. So, and as an aside, when I had the opportunity to be a guest participant of Duwamish River Community Coalition and their participation and leadership as part of the Justice 40 initiative hosted by the Deep South Center and the Bullard Center just last month, it was exciting, it was certainly hopeful, but there was a lot of frustration expressed as well. We had a lot of federal agencies there. Secretary Podestas, or all the bigwigs were there to talk about hope and to encourage all these different community groups to apply for federal funding. And billions of dollars are coming through, and yet the opportunity to do so is like, you know, needle in the haystack, or perhaps as one person put it, it's like they tell us that the landscape is hopeful, you can get there, but it is the path to get there successfully is laden with landmines. And so part of that frustration can be hopeless. They can also be paralyzing because of the political context that community groups may feel that they are in. You don't want to be the subject of an uninvited independent inquiry by senators to actually say, what did you do with taxpayers' money, whether it's federal level or the state level? Are our community groups equipped? I say that now because one of the things that when we talk about people in practice, one of the things that as co-executive director of capacity building that we try and do is confidence. That the coalition can be confident in the fact that we are actually going to be the most solid team that we can be to provide that kind of policy analysis, to co-create with you, to help you code switch, and to be the backup center there for you should there be political and economic threats. But that, translating that to the city or state or federal government that has so much power can be debilitating. And that's why I want to just say a shout out to the tribes. Actually, the Toledo tribe actually hosted Environmental Justice Council last month, our very first in-person meeting. And one of the elders there, upon giving the blessing for the Environmental Justice Council, noted that we're better together. And that was definitely a reference to non-Indigenous frontline community groups like ourselves, and saying that together we have to amplify the message of not just hope, but the fact that the values and the ways in which we govern and the way in which we see participatory governance has to change. So that's my soap.
Absolutely. I want to leave plenty of time to get feedback and questions from the audience, so I will limit myself to just one last question, so you guys can start thinking about what you'd like to ask. And it's for you, Lena. We've been talking, and this last question was sort of like a bigger or higher level about how we need to change and thinking what are the things we need to do. But in terms of, you know, concrete things on a local level, you mentioned the Grandgarden project. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that project, in terms of, you know, how that's doing all the things we're talking about, working at a community level, increasing well-being, but then also, of course, the climate change component. And then finally, because, you know, we've been talking so much, we have to overcome hopelessness. So what gives you hope in the day, in the work that you do day to day?
So I'm not sure how many of you all have heard of a clam garden. Yay, there's so many of you. I love to see that because it's still a very new project in many spaces. And I am so proud of my community and our community environmental health team, our fisheries team, and everybody that our relatives from BC, everybody that's come together to make this possible. And so in August of 2022, so just over a year ago, we started to build a rock wall at Kukatali Preserve, Kikit Islands, within our reservation boundaries, to build a rock wall to build our clam garden. And we moved 33 tons of rock across 2 days to start the building process. And it was, oh man, one of the best days of my life. Honestly, just to see all of the hard work and the years of research and community outreach and just bringing the people together to start this building. And we have the Swinomish community, the people that work with us, and then also BC First Nations people, because they're really leading the way in restoring the clam garden work. And so it's just another way of bringing the people together, community building, and preparing for the future, you know, what's to come with sea level rise, the sea level warming, the climate crisis, everything that we have to face in the future. This is just our way of taking care of our relatives of the sea. You know, it's really more than just a clam garden, it's a sea garden. It supports the growth of clams, sea cucumbers, sea urchin. It'll be a place for fish to spawn, crabs to live. You know, it's the sea garden, and it's restoring what our ancestors knew and what they did for thousands and thousands of years. You know, you can go up to BC and visit a clam garden that is 4,000 years old. That is as old as the pyramids in Egypt. That's the history that we have in this place. And when you go and visit those sites, you're standing on 4,000 years of indigenous knowledge, of the tide and knowing how the sea works and how it changes the shape of the beach when you add a rock terrace at the lowest tidal point. And it just really, it changes the shape of the beach and it allows there for more clams, which in this time is what we need. You know, I know all of us experienced the heat dome in 2020 or 2021, and that was a mass mortality for the shellfish. It was so devastating to see all of those pictures of those clams just baked on the beach. Like even now I talk about it, it still brings tears to my eyes because those are our relatives, you know, and they're not here talking about this right now. They don't have that ability. It's up to us to advocate for them, to speak for them, to protect them and to fight for them. And so this is just one small way that we're able to do that. And in our little corner of the world is to build this clam garden. And so that they have that safe place, and they have that area to grow and to really be prosperous. And it gives me hope because it's bringing the people back together. It's not capitalistic driven. We're not doing it for money. We're doing it for the love of the people and the love of the sea and the love of the land, you know, and it really brings the community together from the youngest to the oldest. I love seeing the youth out there because it's like it's innate, you know, it's in their DNA. They know exactly what they need to be doing out there. And it is the most beautiful thing to see my little cousins able to grow up in that type of culture and that type of environment. And I take direction from them when we're out there because they just know. It's just, they're so pure and so sensitive still to the spirit world that they're just guided and they follow it. You know, so I really have a deep appreciation for the work that I get to do when I get to interact with the young people. That's my favorite thing, is to be guided by them, to be led by them, and to be able to work with them. And yeah, I'm so passionate about the Clam Garden project. I can talk about it all day long. But it really is. It's what gives me hope. And I think the best part about it is you look up beyond. I really hope one day you all get to come and visit the Clam Garden if you haven't already. But when you look up across the water beyond the Clam Garden, there's Hope Island. And so you can literally go out there and be working with us and look up and see hope. So I'm just really grateful for this space and to be able to share a little bit about who we are as Finnish people and the work that we're doing today.
Thank you so much, especially the not over. I just want to open it up now to the floor. So if there are any questions, we have at least 10 minutes, I think. Is that all right? Yeah, for sure. So please welcome questions that anyone has.
Jessica, can I add?
Yeah, please do.
I thank you very much, Elena, for sharing that. And I want to say that your passion gives me hope. Elena gives me hope, Aurora gives me hope, Howie gives me hope, Jessica gives me hope, this panel gives me hope. The fact that we all gathered here today and come from different backgrounds and perspectives. I think in this work, the intersections, I love that we're focusing on the intersections because that is where the work is done. The work is never done in one office or laboratory or room. It's always across lines. For Basilica, it's been working with the Environmental Justice Council and having them come to events. We're working with, I'm going to shout out some awesome organizations that you all should connect to: Black Star Farmers, Black Farmers Collective, Greener Beach Action Coalition, the Duwamish River Community Coalition that we've also worked with, amazing folks, Earth Lab, WISE. Things are putting this together because this is what we need to be doing in order to foster more hope and taking this and putting it into action. So just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Any questions?
That's very helpful. Get this stuff in.
Hi, thanks so much. It's been great learning from all of you and your experiences. I'm hesitant to say this, but I want to kind of complicate hope a little bit, which I'm sure you must understand. It can be used to jumpstart away from the grief and the rage that people feel around what's happening, and in its best form, it can lead to action. I think in some of its maybe least helpful forms, it can lead to, I hope someone's taking care of this. I hope this works out. I hope we don't have to change anything. And I'm hearing from a number of you saying, yeah, actually, things are actually really going to have to change. So I'm going to just round this up. Sorry. How do you incorporate the difficult emotions and sort of, yeah, I'm just wondering if your work with communities has any wisdom you can provide. Hope that was clear. Thanks.
Thank you. Really great question. I don't want to over medicalize things, but I take a lot of lessons from some fields of medicine and nursing, like hospice care and oncology, where grief is a part of everyday work. And so dealing with grief that has a long history. And some of the insights that come out of those fields are the following. First, tell the truth. It never does any good to sugarcoat tough realities. There are some grim things happening. We all know that. And we can't sugarcoat that. So tell the truth. The next is to acknowledge grief. So I don't ever propose hope as a way to speed past grief or bypass grief. Grief is real. You need to call it out and deal with it. But from there comes the transition to having a vision of where we want to go, having a plan for getting there, having the empowerment, the agency to take steps and move down that path. So I think that if you build on some of the clinical insights, or common sense insights, if you will, we have to acknowledge grief and support each other through grief. And then move from there, use that as a step forward. Oh, the other thing I'd say is that, and this was implicit in your comment, there's a difference between hope and optimism. It sounds like it's splitting hairs. Optimism is the passive expectation that things will turn out okay. Hope has action intrinsic to it. Hope means we will take action to achieve the outcomes that we aim for. And so it's important to maintain that distinction. I think what you were, if I heard you right, you were saying that hope can sort of turn into a passive expectation that things will be all right. I would call that hope. For me, hope has action, has rolling up sleeves intrinsic to it. And that's the kind of hope that we need to be propelling. So to call out the truth, to acknowledge grief, to identify the world that we want to move toward. That's a world of sustainability and justice and resilience. And then to identify pathways to get there and to take action, move down those pathways, including the empowerment that requires it. I think that is a sequence that can move us from the bogs and the traps that you talked about toward positive attainment.
I'll say something as well to add, and I think you described a process that flashed through, well, couldn't see the flash through my mind over the last couple of years of working with the coalition. I've been working with them for 4 years, but the process is that you know, and it's a lot of experiencing a lot of things at the same time in this moment, and it is from the bearing witness, I think, when we come together as a community, and when Elise, who actually is one of the policy advocates who actually helped pass the HEAL Act, as we go backwards to how we got to that vision. There was a lot of holding of that grief and recognizing and bearing witness. And the questions about, what does environmental justice mean to you? What does climate justice mean to you? It's actually broken down into, the thing about what do you experience, what's hard in your community. And so I think taking the time to actually, and we try, but we are not in any way perfect at kind of holding space, in a kind of, political or policy process, we'll call them community listening sessions. And with that, we paired up with research, both community-based research and then partnered research with researchers here at the University of Washington and beyond, and then policymakers and other agencies. But before we get to, it was a 2-year process or so. I think, and even now, for the HEAL Act, for example, we needed to actually hold space to actually go through that process. And sometimes, hope for our people, for our coalition is the frustration and the anger that our farmer leader, President Engmann from C2C may actually be pontificating about, expressing at the Environmental Justice Council, saying, I don't have time for this bureaucratic process that you are putting on my people and on this council. It's supposed to be community centered. What it says is what it says, and that's the plain language that I don't want to over-regulate, right? And she just made that right there as an example of jumping from, that sort of fierce, she sort of built up with that anger, that action to I have a vision. Now listen.
Aurora, you mentioned the HEAL Act both in your beginning remarks and again here. What are you looking forward to coming out of that act, specifically with regard to management of air impacts and as they affect climate?
That's a great big question, and I'll try and answer it. Well, I think that, say 3 years from now, I'd like to see that the life expectancy differences are more accurate, or that they are gone. I know that that's 3 years ago. Let's just say whatever period of time. So the life expectancy, the environmental health disparities for our most overburdened communities are directly addressed and correlating to the regulatory and resource issues that are actually, we're talking about right now in this week. Actually, that's one thing. Secondly, concretely, I would like to see that there be a community infrastructure that is independent but related to as a part of the co-governance initiative. That is, the Environmental Justice Council is an example of this idea of co-governance with community groups, those who are most affected, tribes are at the table, as well as the agencies ex officio, but the EJC is within the governor's office. I'd like to see a community infrastructure, much like Office for Public Defense is related but separate, right? So community infrastructure, of which community assemblies, we're working on that right now. We've been able to introduce this term that we didn't coin, but it's out there as part of the larger movement of community assemblies as a place in community gathering spaces around the state where community groups can actually talk about and propose ideas and go through this process. I'd like to see the creation of an environmental justice fund as well, because the most important thing for frontline communities is resources and the ability to command those resources. One last thing, I'm not here, but one of the messages from the Deep South convening was certainly hope, but even more specifically, as a lot of these federal dollars address the crisis that is most impacting frontline, overburdened, lower income people of color communities all over the world. And for our nation, the message is you can have it, there's solar, there's alternative energy, there's what are you doing to actually resource adaptation and mitigation. And, I was talking with a number of other community groups, and the message was, yes, and we also want access to the ability to innovate and solve. So if industry has a certain percentage set aside for research and development, that should fail, why shouldn't communities as well? So that would be another sort of message that I would build into the environmental justice fund. That's all.
All right, I think we are at our time, so one more time, I just want to thank everyone on the panel. Amazing. Thank you very much for introducing me. Thank you so much.